Even when he had trouble breathing, he would not ask me to get down. Looking into my eyes, he would shake his white head and run his scratchy old finger all around my hairline, which was rather low down, nearly to my brows, and made some people say I looked like a baby monkey. My brother was very generous in all this. He let me do all the revivaling. He had done it for years before I was born, and so was glad to be able to pass it on to somebody new. What he would do while I talked to Mr. Sweet was pretend to play the guitar. In fact, think that someone wanted to be like him. In fact, pretend that he was a very young version of Mr. Sweet, and it always made Mr. Sweet glad to think that somebody wanted to be like him. Of course, we did not know this then. We played the thing by ear, and whatever he seemed to like, we did. We were desperately afraid that he was just going to take off one day and leave us. It did not occur to us that we were doing anything special. We had not learned that death was final when it did come. We thought nothing of triumphing over it so many times, and in fact became a trifle contemptuous of people who let themselves be carried away. It did not occur to us that if our father had been dying, we could not have stopped it, that Mr. Sweet was the only person over whom we had power. When Mr. Sweet was in his 80s, I was studying in the university many miles from home. I saw him whenever I went home, but he was never on the verge of dying, that I could tell, and I began to feel that my anxiety for his health and psychological well-being was unnecessary. By this time, he not only had a mustache, but a long, flowing, snow-white beard, which I loved, and combed and braided for hours. He was very peaceful, fragile, gentle, and the only jarring note about him was his old steel guitar, which he still played in the old, sad, sweet, down-home blues way. On Mr. Sweet's 90th birthday, I was finishing my doctorate in Massachusetts, and had been making arrangements to go home for several weeks' rest. That morning, I got a telegram telling me that Mr. Sweet was dying again, and could I please drop everything and come home. Of course I could. My dissertation could wait, and my teachers would understand when I explained to them. When I got back, I ran to the phone, called the airport, and within hours I was speeding along the dusty road to Mr. Sweet's. The house was more dilapidated than when I was there last, barely a shack, but it was overgrown with yellow roses which my family had planted many years ago. The air was heavy and sweet and peaceful. I felt strange walking through the gate and up all the rickety steps, but the strangeness left me as I caught sight of the long white beard I loved so well, flowing down the thin body over the familiar quilt coverlet. Mr. Sweet. His eyes were closed tight, and his hands crossed over his stomach were thin and delicate, no longer scratchy. I remembered how always before I had run and jumped upon him just anywhere. Now I knew he would not be able to support my weight. I looked around at my parents, and was surprised to see that my father and mother also looked old and frail. My father, his own hair was very gray, leaned over the quietly sleeping old man, who incidentally smelled still of wine and tobacco, and said, as he'd done so many times, "To hell with dying, man! My daughter is home to see Mr. Sweet." My brother had not been able to come as he was in the war in Asia. I bent down and gently stroked the closed eyes, and gradually they began to open. The closed, wine-stained lips twitched a little, then parted in a warm, slightly embarrassed smile. Mr. Sweet could see me, and he recognized me, and his eyes looked very spry and twinkly for a moment. I put my head down on the pillow next to his, and we just looked at each other for a long time. Then he began to trace my peculiar hairline with a thin, smooth finger. I closed my eyes when his finger halted above my ear. He used to rejoice at the dirt in my ears when I was little. He had stayed cupped around my cheek. His hand stayed cupped around my cheek. When I opened my eyes, sure that I had reached him in time, his were closed. Even at 24 now, how could I believe I had failed? That Mr. Sweet was really gone. He had never gone before. But when I looked at my parents and saw that they were holding back tears, they had loved him dearly. He was like a piece of rare and delicate china, which was always being saved from breaking, which finally fell. I looked long at the old face, the wrinkled forehead, the red lips, the hands that still reached out to me. Soon I felt my father pushing something cool into my hands. It was Mr. Sweet's guitar. He had asked months ago to give it to me. He did not want me to feel that my trip had been worth nothing. The old guitar, I plucked the strings, hummed Sweet Georgia Brown. The magic of Mr. Sweet lingered still in a cold steel box. Through the window I could catch the fragrant, delicate scent of tender yellow roses. The man on the high old-fashioned bed with a quilt coverlet and a flowing white beard had been my first love.